Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I am pleased to welcome you back to part 2 of our 2-week series titled Safe Communities, Planning for the Future. We have our two same guests from last week, and I'm so pleased to welcome them back. First of all is Representative Mike Mitchell. He has served with distinction in the legislature for many years. He was in the House from 1968 through 70, and he went to the Senate and served there from 1970 to 82. And now, after some years out, he's back in the House, coming to the legislature from Lewiston, Idaho. He also is the former director of the Department of Correction, which is our topic today, and he holds a baccalaureate degree from the University of Oregon in journalism and advertising. Our second guest is Thomas Beauclair. He is the director of the Department of Correction, Idaho, from 2001 to the present time, and he's served in that department in some capacity for the last 30 years. Our guest holds a baccalaureate degree in criminal justice from Boise State University and a master's in counseling from the College of Idaho, now known as Albertson College. And I should add, we're proud to say that at one point he was a student at North Idaho College. And to both gentlemen, welcome. We're so pleased to have you back, and it was most informative last week. And I'm pleased to have our regular panelists back, Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and also Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And Janelle will start today's questioning.
Welcome back to the program, gentlemen. It was very informative last week, and I'm sure our viewers will find that it's very informative this week as well. You're going to be holding some meetings around the state to hopefully make our communities safer. What do you hope to gain from that? Tom, can you tell us a couple of the items that you hope will be discussed during those meetings?
Sure. I think primarily to dispel some of the myths about corrections and probation and parole. And I think the sex offender, the predator sex offender issue is a real good one to start with. You know, the events that we had a couple up here that took place, those are not normal events. If you look at the number of sex offenders in prison, about 20%, roughly 1,200, about 9% on probation and parole. There's a significant amount of people that have committed sex offenses that do not act out that way. So that's one. The other thing I hope to is to get the community to embrace what the criminal justice system is trying to do, because it really is a community problem. These people come from the community into the system, and 98% are going to leave the prison system and come back to the community. And really the only way to properly supervise is to have guardians in the community, not just a probation officer with a caseload of 65 to 100. So those are the two top priorities for me.
Mike, you've described what's going on around us as sort of a wake-up call. How would you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the public and even those who participate in the justice system, I think there's a lack of what I think an understanding on the part of the general public. But in my investigation of talking to various elements, I have a feeling that it's about time that all of the interested parties that participate, that deal with these people that Tom has to deal with, or sends back out into the community, get together. And that comes back to local law enforcement, the judges. I'm not sure that the prosecutors know what the probation parole does. I'm not sure probation parole reviews any of the history of what the prosecutors based his case on. I don't know that they review the judge's sentencing. You know, that's what, I'm not sure they know it enough to please me. And I feel the same way about the public. I think the public would support the department if they fully understand what the department's successes are and how a little more help, a little more understanding would improve, even increase the number of successes.
Erna Reinhardt.
Tom, I would like, last week you shared with us a couple of statistics, and I want to go back to those if we could. Number one, I hope you can remember what the statistic was about substance abuse abusers and what that has done in the last 10 years or so. Can you share that with our viewers?
Well, let me go back just a little bit to put it in context. When 30 years ago, what we had in prison was a a alcoholic. Today we have polydrug users that will use almost anything, but primarily the problem is methamphetamine. And what we're seeing today that about 85% or higher have a substance abuse problem that are in prison. With females, the substance abuse is directly related to their crime, and it is with males in about half the time. So we have a lot of evidence that there's a substance abuse problem, yet there's very little community-based treatment. And so that's a huge issue. It's a disconnect between the system and what goes on in the community. And that's something I think we need to shore up.
It sounds to me like the chicken and the egg. It's like you get these individuals when they're already so far down the road on a path that may not be productive and don't have all the resources to help them. And it is very much is a community problem. I wanted to ask Mike, share with us perhaps some of your ideas as a legislator in Idaho, maybe what the legislature could do to help with the drug problem.
Well, if we use meth, which that's the magic word that everybody talks about now. If we look at meth not as an elimination of the presence of meth available for people to buy, but looking at the production of meth within our state, I think that has to be really a strengthened program by a law that takes the things off of the shelf and puts them behind the counter or eliminates them altogether so that the people that want to cook can't cook in Idaho right now. This is the only state around us that they can cook.
Exactly.
Because they can buy the stuff here and go out and cook it, or they can steal it, which is what they also do. So that's the issue that I think. Then the other one is Tom hasn't been put on the spot yet, but Tom's alluded to the fact we got crowding, and crowding puts him in a position where some of the treatment he would like to provide, will say like to the substance abuse people, he simply doesn't have it. Correct me if I'm wrong. So to me, we're talking now probably the need perhaps to look at a facility. That's one, very expensive. What should the facility look like? Well, to me, it should look like a facility that can take care of mental illness and can take care of substance abuse as a primary. Tom may not agree with me on this, but because he and I haven't discussed this one at all. But these two areas are ones in which, when we toured the prison, Tom takes the legislature out and does an excellent job. We found that mental health people were in the same cell block with others in which it wasn't the environment Tom wanted them to be in, but that's the only environment Tom had. That was it.
Exactly.
So that's why I think we have to do those kind of things. And then an item so the program doesn't get away before I mention it, Tom has to have the ability to keep good personnel there, to train in either mental illness or in substance abuse, or just plain control of an inmate population that's growing. And I've always feared that when the legislature fails to recognize our state employees and their needs financially, we have danger of losing the ones that Tom wants to keep and ending up with ones that do not have the time. And then that makes his job and his supervisors twice as busy when they should be. So that's going to be part of one of the crusades I'm on. Let's keep good people there, but you got to pay them to stay.
Excellent.
I want to deal with some statistics nationally and compare them with Idaho, and some of this came up briefly last week. That's why it's good to have two shows and follow-up. But near the end of the show, maybe we were off the air, Tom, you talked about that nationwide we have two kinds of crime, crimes against property and crimes against persons, and even though we have some terrible crimes that we hear about now, statistically speaking, overall crimes are lower than they were in the last 10 or 12 years, something. I believe crimes statistically have declined. Yet at the same time, we hear, and Mike just mentioned that, we hear that in Idaho and a lot of other states, the prisons are full, lack of enough facilities. How do these two go together, where even though the crime rate may be down, prisons are full?
It's a complex issue. First of all, Idaho is the fourth fastest growing state in the country, so that contributes to significant growth in prison. However, the growth in prison is much faster than the growth of the state. So we have other problems. And I go back to the lack of community-based treatment. I think when drug crimes are the primary growth cause of prison growth. And if you don't have community-based treatment, there's really no continuum. There's no alternative to prison. So if I'm a probation officer or a judge and I have somebody out there in the community that's using, and maybe they're not committing crimes, but they have committed a crime before, and now they've relapsed, and I put them on a waiting list that's maybe 3 months to get them into treatment, I got to put them in prison because they will commit a crime. So, I mean, that's how significant this problem is and how complex it is. And then with methamphetamine, it usually takes a different kind of treatment, a longer type of treatment, and you really can't mix the two together. So they're huge issues. 20% of the population are mental health inmates. The largest state hospital in the state is the prison in our state. And so, I mean, I could go on and on and on about some of these major issues.
So it is complex, but you're helping me understand the statistics. On the one hand, and we talked last week, Idaho comes out really well compared with the national average on the much lower repeat rate.
Correct.
I think we're about half what the national average is. You mentioned the national was 60-something, we're 30-something, I believe.
39 for males and 31 for females.
But it's 60-some% nationally.
That's correct.
But then at the same time, that's been very effective in Idaho to keep down the repeat offenders, yet because of the population growth, that still explains why we have, partially explains why we have very crowded conditions in prisons.
Well, let me put it in dollars, because that helps, I think, a little bit. Our capital budget is almost $200 million for just next year. We actually need to build 3 prisons. That's how far we are behind the curve.
We need to tell our viewers from outside the state we're not like our total budget is not like a lot of states. Mike, the total budget in Idaho is about
A little over, yeah, $1.2 billion.
what, 1.2 billion, and that's a lot of money out of that small budget compared with a lot of states. Mike, I turn to you, and I'm going back to, I remember some speeches given by Governor Phil Batt when he was in office about this issue, and I know Governor Batt spoke several times to the issue that he thought that, you know, we're taxing ourselves more in the budget. We have to deal with, this is a problem we have to deal with, but he gave a lot of emphasis to violent crime versus nonviolent. He said because of some laws we had written, if I understood him correctly, that that was part of the challenge too. Would you speak to that?
Well, undoubtedly, there's always a good time, and this may be it, to review the laws and how they impact the system. We have a couple of programs in Idaho that I hope will come out in the public discussions, and that's what was 120, but we now call it 180-day rider program, one which is in Pocatello and one which is at Cottonwood. Now, those 2 programs are generally under the strong influence of the judges. If they place someone out of that program on parole, the judge is the one that places them there, and they are supervised by probation parole officers, but they are not under the parole commission. The inmates within Tom's jurisdiction, when they come out, if they are on probation, if they're the indeterminate part of their sentence, then they are supervised by probation and parole, and they are controlled by the parole commission. Those are the 2 different areas. I think that what we need to look at is the success of the 180-day program as to whether that needs expansion, or the ability of local areas, the treatment of mental illness, or the detoxing, or the drug addiction, as to whether we can stop it for a little while before Tom has to take them, unless we give Tom the money and the opportunity to take care of them. Because we're putting them in there and they haven't had anything except being judged. The other issue that I think is that we take a look and see where some of these crimes, the mandatory minimums and that, what we might be doing with juveniles. I hope Tom will deal with whether we have an increase in younger people that are being incarcerated, particularly in the sexual offense area. Concerns me.
Yeah. Janelle Burke.
I'll ask that question then, Tom. How about juveniles, and what are you finding with juvenile offenders?
Well, of course, the juveniles are a separate system. We have a juvenile Department of Corrections, but I think what Mike was alluding to is that we are seeing more juveniles come into the adult system. And I don't have a number for that, but we are seeing an increase. And generally speaking, those are violent crimes or repeat offenders that just can't be handled anywhere else, and then we do get those.
Along that same line, my question to you, Tom, really has to do with the differences between, I suppose, what you would call the severity, but it's not really the severity. I'm not sure I can articulate this very well, but what I really want to ask is, when people in the community are looking at offenders, should they be looking at some offenders in different ways than others? In other words, we know that there are some very violent offenders who are never going to be able to probably work very well on the outside of a prison system. So can you comment on that,
Yes,
please?
I appreciate that question because it's one that's really important. And let me give you an example. I recently came to this community to talk to community members about a problem that they had with two sex offenders living together in their neighborhood. And we were supervising at that time, I may be wrong on the numbers, but what I remember is about 50 sex offenders in this community. Well, there are 250 registered sex offenders that aren't being supervised. And that's a hole we need to plug. And I'll give you another example of how that occurs. If you're sentenced to prison for, let's say, 15 years for a sex offense, and there's no treatment there for the most part, and so generally speaking, they'll stay in prison longer. And so they will actually top their sentence out, meaning they come out of prison without parole supervision. And that's an area that we really want to fix this year in the legislature, and I'm working with a number of legislators to try to do that. But going back to your question, if we put, as an example, all sex offenders in one box, that's really not a good way to supervise or manage this population. We don't have enough money to do that. We've looked at some legislation that's being talked about that would increase the length of sentence and also add lifetime supervision, which I support, but it will cost $1 billion in the next 30 years. So there's a price when we start talking about tightening this stuff up, and I think most people would support, let's do it the smart way. Let's do exactly what your question is asking. Let's take those people that are a threat to the community and tighten that part up, but not across the board. This needs to be a measured response.
Thank you very much.
Erna?
Tom, my question is probably somewhat related to your answer that you just gave, but I'm going to ask it anyway because you might have a chance to give us a new answer. But are there some model programs out there or some success stories out there that we could bring into Idaho? Or if you had one thing that you could implement in the next year or two, what would that be?
Well, the latter question is the easiest to answer, and that would be increased treatment. We have about 50% capacity of what our needs are in prison. And I know a lot of people don't advocate for inmates because they think that they are getting their just dessert by being in prison. But there is not one one research information that I'm aware of that says just incarceration reduces recidivism. What reduces recidivism is incapacitation as well as treatment. So you need to do both, and we do not have enough treatment anywhere in the state, not just in prison, but in the community either.
So is the solution more money, more facilities, or a combination of both?
Well, I think it is a combination of both. You need to provide the resources following best practices and what science tells you to do that makes the most efficient way of utilizing the money. But if I haven't already said it, this is a community problem. It's not a prison problem. These people are all coming back to the community, and until the community engages in the problem as part of the solution, we're going to just continue to have spiral growth and a decrease in the amount of money that people have in their pockets because government's going to take you've got to pay for it.
If I could add to that, one of the things that I mentioned earlier as being one of the elements in this big picture, Department of Employment. Now, when an inmate in the programs now, since Tom has been there and perhaps before, but I want to correct something. I was the director of corrections only because the director quit one day, and they had to find somebody to run the situation for about 3 or 4 months. So don't put me in this man's professional category because I'm not there, not at all. But I did learn there because we have of the importance of inmates having something to sustain them, because they are going to get out, as Tom pointed out. They're not all of them going to stay there forever. And they need, like prison industries, fire crews and things like that. In Lewiston, we have the red shirts do city work, and they build up a little cash, because when they get out, they're not going to have a job unless we get the Department of Employment looking at their former employer, trying to get that relationship back together, looking for job opportunities, because they will go back to their community eventually. They may end up in Boise to start with because that's the first place. But they'll tell you this: there's 2 things I do not want to deny myself. One is a place to stay, and the other is food. And if I don't have some way of providing for that, there's 2 things I know for sure. I know how to steal, and I know how to fence. And so it's very important that the programs that they have, keep in mind that building up that little bit of cash helps, plus the importance of employment to be there before the person is released and when they arrive back there, to try and see if there isn't a job opportunity.
Tom, our viewers might be interested to know that from some of the judges and some of your people and others, for more than a year and a half, I've had the opportunity to meet with them some, and as you were planning this and what Mike has talked about concerning the statewide educational process, and it's been most interesting, and I commend all of you for this. And you did have a consulting firm that came in and did a study. And one of the things, I had a privilege of talking to them and also then seeing some of the results. One of the things that came out of this, I understand, I'd like for you to address, and Mike might want to do that from the perspective of a legislator too, and that is, there's so many different entities in this whole process, in the judicial system, and Mike's identified some of those today. And what I thought I heard from that report was that some entities, not deliberately, but they don't communicate much together, and they advise some kind of council where you get all these people together. Would you and Mike both address, would that help some too if we have better communication through the whole system?
There's no question about it, and there are problems. Certainly there are. The informations we have today in the system, most systems are very antiquated, and we don't have the ability to communicate with each other, and they're just antiquated systems. I can say that the governor has appointed a criminal justice council to look at a number of issues over the coming years, the gang problem, methamphetamine problem, prison growth, and sex offender. And I think this whole idea about groups coming together, because law enforcement's at the table, parole commission's at the table, corrections at the table, legislature's at the table, we can begin talking about some of these issues, because it's rare for us all to get together and have that kind of conversation. So I think this governor's commission is going to help.
So something like communication. And Mike, for someone who's been involved in the public policy a long, long time, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I plan to do what I can with Tom's approval, is to try and get the various entities to take the Gold Room, which is a conference room at the Capitol building, and on a weekly basis in the early part of the session to come in and legislators, committee or not committee members, come to those to the Gold Room and hear the prosecutors tell us how they deal and what are the issues of which they do not understand. A comment that I just received, I wrote it down here. They know little about what the available case might be after conviction. Mm-hmm. And so the legislature doesn't know how to help them because the prosecutors never told the legislature that there was a problem. And it goes to the judges. The judges, in many cases, aren't sure what's going to happen after they sentence. They do in the 180-day program because they retain jurisdiction, which they don't under the other. The legislature needs to know what Tom is trying to do on a statewide basis now, And the only way you do it is you put them in the gold room, you lock the door, and you don't let them leave until they've heard the presentation. That's basically
Kind of like
it.
the last couple of days of legislature when you lock the doors and people can't get
That's
out.
it. If you can lock it, I'd highly suggest it.
There sounds like something else here too. It's people are going through this system. When one particular entity gets through and it goes to someone else, that's about all they know about it. That is, they don't. There's no thread running through the whole process.
That's true.
One other thing that I want to do, because I've heard a lot of here locally from our judges and all that, is the drug court. Either when they react, they seem here to say that they've had some success. We know that from your statistics that the drug problem and meth in particular has really filled a lot of facilities, local and state facilities. What is your opinion about drug court? Is that something that's helpful?
I think it's very helpful. I've gone to a lot of the drug court graduations, and I meet with the judges on a regular basis. There probably isn't anything that's working as well today as drug court is. So I'm very supportive of drug court.
Mike,
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. What my concern is that the drug court program should probably need some expansion. In other words, make sure that we're covering all the opportunities that are available to us. What's bothering me is that when we establish those additional drug courts, we have to take the money from someplace else. And the court doesn't like me to say this, but I tell the court, I said, why don't you raise the fees and you start funding the additional drug court programs, because they're under your jurisdiction and they work and the public would support it. They don't particularly like to hear me say that, but it's going to come up again, because I don't think we can rob from anything Tom needs the money for, or over in health and welfare, or from the public schools, or from higher ed, to maintain and expand a good program when the courts have the ability to, within their own system, to expand the program and fund it.
And it has the advantage of, one, it keeps more people out of the prison system, and number two, it gets them off the drugs oftentimes.
And it keeps family units together.
Mm-hmm.
That's another big problem.
It's a tough program, because if they don't stay on it, then they've got problems if they don't stay off of the drugs.
And they are expanding this year as well as mental health courts.
On that note, once again, we have to bring the program to conclusion. There's one thing happens on this program, that is the clock always wins. It's never lost. Thank you both very, very much. Tom and Mike, you've been extremely informative for us, and good luck in your work across the state.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have enjoyed bringing these two programs on a very, very serious and important topic, and we hope you've garnered information that will be helpful to you in whatever state you're in and are in Canada. And we would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, when we're going to move to yet another issue. Throughout this 34th year, we have a lot of different issues that we're going to bring to you, and we hope you'll be with us on a regular basis each week. Until next week, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.